sons and daughters.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Aurora Smedley podcast, where I speak with you about what the world needs to hear. And in today's episode, I'm going to be speaking about Wu Wei, which is the Chinese Daoist concept of least effort. And I am excited to talk about this because this is something that Westerners find typically very bizarre. It's something that I hear Westerners being very confused about because in Western culture, we really emphasize the principles of hard work, of diligence, of hustle, of grinding. All of these things that, while can be beneficial in some ways, can also be to our detriment, can set us back. So the idea of Wu Wei does not actually mean no effort. It doesn't mean that you do not take action. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything. It's actually a principle of least effort, of aligning yourself with universal flow so that you can create end results with the least exertion of energy. So in order for us to have this discussion, I'm going to clarify two different definitions. The first being Wu Wei and the second being the Tao. Wu Wei, like I said, is the concept of least effort. It doesn't mean no effort. Rather, it means aligning yourself with the universal flow in order to create an end result. The second principle that I'm going to point out is the concept of the Tao. The Tao I'm going to define as universal currents of energy. So we can think of the Tao as almost if the whole universe was a river. There are different currents in the river. There's different currents in the ocean. There's different tides in the ocean. You can think of the Tao as the currents of universal energy. So with the context of what Wu Wei is and the context of the Tao, we can think of Wu Wei as aligning yourself with the Tao, these currents of energy, in order to create the results that we would like with the least amount of exerted effort. You can think of this as when the tide is going out, if you are swimming hard to get back to shore, you are going to be going against the current and you're going to have to hustle and grind really hard in order to not go very far. Whereas if the tide is coming back in, if you are paddling to get to shore, you're going to get to shore with much more ease and grace and less effort than you would if you were when the tide was going out. Similarly, if you are trying to get from one place to another in a jungle, you could either bushwhack your way through the forest to get from one place to another, or you can jump in the river and the river is going to take you to exactly where you need to go. So this is the idea of Wu Wei, that there is kind of these currents in the universe, currents in the flow of energy, and that if you align yourself with these, then everything takes much less time, effort, and energy. And you could actually sometimes do very little in order to achieve a much greater result than someone who has to bushwhack through the forest and maybe make a half a mile of progress per day. The most similar idea to Wu Wei is actually the Western concept of leverage. So with leverage, which is a term that's very popular in the business world, we are making the smallest action in order to create the largest amount of results. This makes me think of the Archimedes quote, "Give me a large enough lever and I can move the world." So in a similar bent, this Western concept of leverage means that you are creating the most results with the least action. So you are choosing an action that is going to have the greatest amount of results. Wu Wei is similar to this, but it has a different focus. Rather than being results focused, it's actually focused on how is the current weather of the universe going? What are the currents in the Tao at this moment? And what is the best action that I can take in this moment, considering the universal flow, considering the flow of the Tao, considering the universe weather, so to speak. The concept of leverage also differs from Wu Wei in that the leverage is making the assumption that you are the agent that is creating the end result. Whereas Wu Wei has a different perspective, and that is that the universe is creating the end result, and you are simply aligning yourself with the overall tides and current and flow that are inherent to the universe. Westerners, when they're speaking about leverage, will usually ask questions like, what is the one thing that I can do that is going to create the most disproportionate amount of results? Whereas people that are thinking in terms of Wu Wei will ask questions more like, how do I align myself with universal flow in order to accomplish my end goals? How do I align myself with the Tao in order for my goals to achieve themselves? In the Western perspective, there's a much more significant focus on your own agency, your own input in creating the end result. Whereas Taoism and Wu Wei are a bit more humble in thinking that we are not the sole cause of the end result, and that there is larger forces at work which we align ourselves with in order to get to our end point. I'm going to create several examples in order to kind of illustrate this concept of Wu Wei. And the first example that I'm going to discuss is childbirth and the gestation period. So we know that a human child is going to be in the womb for about 9 months, and that this is not a process that we can speed up or hustle in order to get it to happen more quickly. There is a certain time frame that it's going to take, and there's no amount of hustle, there's no amount of grind, there's no amount of productivity hacks that we can do that is going to make a child come out of the womb faster, that's going to properly develop a human child. There is no amount of hacks or shortcuts that we can do in order to make that happen more quickly. Similarly, when we set out to accomplish our goals, there are certain time frames that things take, which are going to take that amount of time, that there is nothing that we can really do in order to hack our way into having the end result faster. And that by trying to accelerate the process, it can actually damage the long-term well-being of the end result, that it may destabilize the long-term outcome past the end result. So for example, let's say that we have a tree and we want this tree to go from a seed to being a fruiting tree at the fastest pace possible. Well, we know that there is a certain time frame that it's going to take for an apricot tree to grow from a seed into a fruit-bearing tree. And this may take 3 or 4 years, let's say. But if you try to accelerate that process by dumping more water on the tree, you could actually drown the tree. Or if you try to force the fruit to occur sooner, perhaps by exposing it to different light and dark cycles, You may get there sooner, but the roots of the tree will be weaker and less able to sustain the fruit once it arrives, and less able to sustain itself against wind and weather conditions. Moreover, you would have to exert much more energy to force these light and dark cycles, these fake seasons, in order to get it to that end result in the first place. The Wu Wei understanding would be to give it the natural amount of water it needs, give it the natural amount of fertilizer that it needs, and wait the appropriate amount of time for the tree to come into fruition, literally. But the Western parallel, right, would be trying to hack our way to getting this tree to come to fruit sooner. But this could destabilize the tree, prevent the tree from being able to produce fruit as effectively. It could make it more susceptible to disease, to weather, to wind. It could make the fruit ultimately less nutritious and healthy for us when we eat it. So there are all sorts of issues that can come from trying to hustle a natural process. But in Western culture, we frequently make the mistake of thinking that other processes, such as starting a business, writing a book, exercising, that these are not the exact same as an apricot tree that must take a certain amount of time to get to its fruiting phase. So in Western culture, we often focus on these hacks, on these shortcuts in order to get to where we want to be, without recognizing that the long-term consequences of this accelerated process can actually be deleterious to our ultimate literal or metaphorical fruit. Another example that I'm going to make here is that when we plant seeds, we know that we are typically going to plant seeds during a certain time of the year in order for that seed to be successful as our crops, right? There is an appropriate time, there is an appropriate manner in which we plant these seeds. We know that if we are going to put seeds in the ground in the middle of winter, when we're in the middle of a cold snap, is probably not the right time for us to go out and plant seeds. This would be an example of hustling, right? I'm going to go out and hustle and plant seeds in the ground in the middle of winter. Sounds like a waste of effort, because this effort is not in alignment with the universal flow of energy at that time, namely with the seasons. So the idea with Wu Wei is not to do nothing, is not to not take action, but rather to understand the universal context in which everything is occurring. That there is a universe context to the actions that we're taking, and that in certain contexts, in certain universe seasons, in certain points of the flow of the universe, will be more advantageous for us to take certain actions versus not take certain actions. But how do we know what is the universe flow? How do we know what is in quote unquote appropriate timing? How do we know this? Well, we begin to see that certain actions that we take create more flow and harmony in the universe, whereas other actions that we take create more disruption and more turbulence in the universal flow. So the practice begins to be in taking action and observing how these actions are occurring as we do them. But a significant characteristic of taking actions in alignment with Wu Wei is to take an action from complete detachment from the end result, to take action without coming from a place of neediness or from a place of unworthiness in taking that action. And we can interrogate the quote unquote Tao by consulting our intuition. Our map for the Tao, our map for the universe, and our understanding for when is the appropriate timing in the universal flow is going to need to originate from our intuition. As we align with our intuition, as we connect with our intuition and act from a place of non-expectation, this is how we begin to align ourselves with what is wanting to manifest through us. If something wants to manifest through us, our relationship to it is typically more neutral and doesn't come from a place of, I need this to happen in order to demonstrate anything, in order to demonstrate my worthiness, in order to demonstrate that I'm cool, in order to demonstrate that I have status. These kinds of intentions, when we have ulterior motives to our actions, this creates turbulence in the universe ripples. This creates turbulence in the Tao and makes it more likely that there will be chaos or disorder in our lives when we are acting from a place of neediness. Generally, when we feel the need to make something happen before it's time, it's because we are coming from a place of insecurity, that we need this thing to happen sooner because otherwise we feel insecure, we feel insignificant, we feel that we are less worthy for some reason or another. So this is actually the source of a lot of the Western paradigm of hustle, of grind, of shortcuts, etc., is that we are looking for a way to compensate for our internal sense of insecurity and deficiency. So this is why we get into the trap of rushing ourselves, of pushing ourselves to make things happen sooner. So when we, as Westerners, are engaging with the concept of Wu Wei, we have to pull back from this instinct of rushing the process in order to make ourselves look good, in order to be socially validated, and instead align ourselves with the flow of energy and allow the process that wants to happen through us to happen through us. And I'm going to present one more metaphor to kind of synthesize these ideas. And the first is that you can think of the Tao as being all of the water currents, all of the water tides, all of the weather on the ocean. And there's all of these currents that are going in different directions, that are changing all the time. The tides are going in and out, and this is happening all the time. You can think of this as being like the Tao. The way that you determine which way to go is not just through where you want to go, but also through understanding this universal weather through your intuition. And your intuition is like a compass or a weather vane. It is a way of kind of getting your bearings in the churning, in the movement, in the constant dynamism of the Tao. You can think of Wu Wei as the practice of aligning yourself with the Tao through the compass of your intuition. Wu Wei is the art of navigating in the ever-changing landscape of the ocean with its changing tides, changing currents, changing weather patterns. Wu Wei is navigating and aligning yourself with the currents in order to get to where you want to be. So Wu Wei does not mean that you are aimlessly being cast about, that you are just going with the flow, that you don't have any say in things. You're just allowing the currents to take you wherever you want. If you do that, you could just be at sea forever, going around and around in one current, right? But Wu Wei is navigating with the understanding of the universal flow of all of these energy patterns. So this metaphor should give you a better understanding of all of the concepts that we've been discussing. So with that, thank you again for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast.